Last night, TVO aired a documentary entitled The Drop about youth in Canada and the U.S. and the different ways in which they do and don't get involved in various forms of political activity. But at the core of the issue is voting, and Canada in general is not doing all that well in that department. 61% of Canadians voted in the 2011 federal election. Compared to 17 peer countries, Canada ranked 14th, in part because 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds did not vote. To help us understand why, and if the electoral participation winds might be blowing differently this year, we welcome, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Brigitte de Pape, Get Out the Youth Vote campaigner with the Council of Canadians. And here in studio, Ian Capstick, managing partner at Media Style and a former NDP staffer, Heather Bastido, former Skelton Clark Fellow at Queen's University, Taylor Gunn, founding president of Civics, and Safia Chaudhry, co-founder of Candidate Youth Engagement Workshop, which is also known as Can You Engage, for short. Brigitte, it's great to have you on the line from the left coast. Thanks, everybody, for being here in the studio with us now. We want to start our discussion by just taking a look at a clip from the documentary in case anybody missed it last night. Here's what it looked like, and then we'll come back and chat. Roll the clip, please.
So did you guys vote?
We did, yes.
I did not vote. You did not? Are you going to vote?
No, I've never voted.
Is there a reason for that?
It's just not something I feel like I should waste my time on.
Really?
In my opinion.
I find this mighty ironic considering that we're canvassing for Kay Hagan right now.
Yeah, it is ironic, but I mean, I might as well get money from the people who are lying to me.
If I want to affect something, I could go out and tell people that their dollar is a vote, more than their vote is a vote. How you spend your money on different corporations and stores keeps those corporations alive. And these politicians are tied in with people who own these corporations. So I can vote for a politician to get in, or I can spend my money locally on different things that's actually going to affect change in my city.
Ian, to you first. How much of this is rooted in the fact that young people think politics is corrupt and therefore not worth their time?
Some of it is certainly rooted in that, absolutely, but I don't know that it's all that. I think what we need to do is take a look at a variety of different reasons as to why young people don't vote. First and foremost, I think that the political system doesn't really speak to young people the vast majority of the time. But again, a lot of the flip side of that is that young people don't often know everything about the system or feel under-informed, so therefore would rather abstain on that particular vote. So there's a lot of different reasons that young people don't vote, but really it's the responsibility of the system itself to sort those out and address them. But instead what's happening in Canada right now is kind of the opposite. Because those young people don't vote, no policies or information is developed for them, and instead what ends up happening is they get re-disenfranchised perhaps time and time again. So we're creating a system in essence where, because we never spoke to those youngest voters first, when they become those older voters, perhaps their issues aren't actually on the agenda.
We will unpack a lot of those themes as we go through our discussion tonight. Heather, when you were at Queen's and teaching and presumably asking young people whether they intended to participate in elections, how often did you hear, "They're all corrupt, I'm not wasting my time"?
Pretty often. However, I also did focus groups with older voters, and older voters feel exactly and precisely the same way. And this is pretty critical for us to look at, is that's not what's driving young people not to vote, and it's young people altogether are not completely disengaged. There are segments of the youth cohort that are engaged. My students at Queen's certainly were. Young people with less or lower levels of education are the ones most likely to be disengaged. And getting back to Ian's point, they don't know a lot about politics, and they feel alienated from it, and it's hard to get to them.
So Taylor, just to come full circle on this thing, the corruption angle. They're all corrupt, they're all the same, I'm not interested in wasting my time. You do or do not hear a lot of that?
So we work with thousands of teachers across the country, and how we get our read on what young people think and feel is through them. That's exactly how our parallel election program starts, with students complaining that it's not worth their time, use of words like corruption. I feel the same way as Heather, though, and this is just coming from experience, is that it's just the whole population that might feel that politicians or even our bureaucracy at times is corrupt. It's kind of hard for me to differentiate between like young people and old people when it comes to those feelings. And what we've discovered over time is that it's harder for people to feel that when they become more engaged in the political process. And usually that starts with interest that forms into knowledge, might develop into like a commitment or even a capacity to participate. And that's where you start to see those negative attitudes fall away.
Okay, that was a clip from the documentary. We also took our cameras out to the streets of Everyday Ontario, and got some other views on why people do or don't vote. Let's roll that clip.
Most people for most of human history, and many millions of people today, still do not have the right to vote and the right to participate freely in a democratic system. But I do have that right, and I thought it would be a shame if I let me and what I believe just sit on the sidelines.
I feel like people who don't vote, like, you're missing out on a great opportunity. So it's really important, because we should be grateful that we have the right and to vote and to be involved in our government this way.
Apparently living in a democracy. So if we're not getting everyone out to vote, then we're not actually making change.
Spoiling the ballot is the best way, like, for my own conscience to protest in the way that I see fit, while still actively participating in a system that I still believe in.
As you hear, like, a lot of young people these days, we're always trying to get more people to vote, because when one person says, oh, I'm not going to vote because it's not going to make a difference, if more people are saying that, that's going to make a difference.
Okay, some thoughtful comments there. Here is a look at how the generations vote, and boy, does this speak volumes. Look at the bars on this graph. On the left end, 18 to 24-year-olds in the last election, that's 2011, not even 40% of them voted. Move to the right and look at the 65 to 74 age cohort, and you wonder why the parties speak to them. They show up. 75% plus vote. Safia, let's explore this a little further. Beyond the cynicism, which we've heard already in some of the comments, what are some of the reasons that you hear that young people are voting in such small numbers?
I think, first of all, there needs to be a clarification between cynicism not necessarily translating as engagement. I think cynicism is fundamentally being engaged, and we've seen in that report.
Cynicism equals engagement?
Of course. When I've spoken to young people, when I've spoken to other groups that traditionally have lower voter turnouts, you speak to them and they fundamentally care about what's happening in the community. They translate their concerns about political issues, but that's not translating into the ballot box. And we see that the report from Samara recently, which showed that young people are participating at a higher level in non-traditional ways of political engagement, so protesting, signing petitions, involvement in the community, but for some reason that's not translating to the ballot box. And I think it comes down to the fact that voting for many young people is just simply not relevant. And particularly, I think this is even truer when we look at racialized young people, when we look at people from the inner suburbs, when we look at lower income young people. It's when you're trying to get your way through school, when you're trying to support your family, why are you going to show up to the polling booth, especially when no one is speaking to your issues? So I think that cynicism is fundamentally engagement, but it's convincing them that voting is in fact worthwhile, and that the cynicism can perhaps be translated and can make an impact if one does show up on election day or advance voting. As I welcome our guest from Vancouver to the discussion right now, I know you get this all the time, Brigitte, but we're going to do it here anyway, because some people may remember how you blasted onto the Canadian political firmament not that long ago. You were a page on Parliament Hill. Sheldon, you want to bring up the image here? This was something that Brigitte did in order to show that she did not, this was not cynicism, this was political engagement to be sure, but it wasn't the kind of political engagement that the government of the day appreciated very much. So Brigitte, as we look at that sign of you saying "Stop Harper," give us your sense about when you're working on campuses, why people say, we don't vote and we don't care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, like Sophia mentioned, a lot of young people aren't voting. 2/3 of young people didn't vote in the last election. But at the same time, I think that can change in this election. And one of the most popular things that I encounter when I'm talking to students on campus is that they want a change in government. A recent poll showed that 80% of young people believe that it's time for a change in government. So while it's true that in the last election many young people didn't vote, I think that in this election that can change, and we can make that change possible by encouraging to get out the vote.
Is that to suggest, Brigitte, that if the anti-conservative forces could somehow get their act together, more young people would participate?
I think so, and I think that that's starting to happen. For example, we saw Mrs. Universe, Ashley Collingbull, calling on people to vote. Incredible. Seeing people changing their profile pictures to "I will vote" as part of the Vote Nation movement. Seeing young people who are pledging to vote in this election who didn't vote in the previous election. So I do think that we are starting to see a wave of change.
Let's throw some more tape up here right now. If we can, Sheldon, we have another group of streeters here, young people expressing why they have a problem voting. Let's roll it.
Well, I feel a lot of people, for one, think it's a lot of work. It's so much work to figure out what they stand for, what these parties are doing, and for another, a lot of them feel it won't make any difference.
I wish that they spent more time trying to get people our age to vote. They don't really make an effort. They could be putting lots of stuff on my feeds, my Twitter and my Facebook feeds. They could be putting posters out in schools, because schools areas are the places where you see stuff like that. They could be doing tons of stuff, and I honestly think that they're not trying to get young people to vote, because if they are, they're doing a really bad job right now.
I do see the candidates trying to reach out. My only problem with that is that they're using a lot of advertisements instead of really trying to put their viewpoint out and not debating the other viewpoints.
Heather, they're not trying to get youth votes. Is that right?
Probably, generally speaking, the war rooms aren't trying. I would say individual candidates care deeply, or some individual candidates care deeply. I followed some MPs around in a study to see how they engage young people, and I saw members of Parliament across the spectrum engage young people, but it is really hard. The public square is almost empty, so they have to go to them. Young people want them to speak in plain language, and they want to talk about issues. Young people want to be engage in issues that they care about, not issues I sat in the Monk debate, and as engaging as it was for me, it's not exactly engaging for all young people, particularly lower income young people.
Ian, it's a lot of work to vote, one of the people in that clip suggested.
He's right.
He's right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of work to...
Well, imagine if you're a college student, a university student, or you're an apprentice in a trade, it is a lot of work. You might also have a kid, you might have a couple of jobs, and it might also be exam season, or there might be an essay due. So yeah, it is a lot of work for anybody to vote. You know, for even the most privileged individuals, it takes time and effort to go do that.
You mean to be
and you have to want to do it,
to
right?
be up enough on the issues to
Exactly.
participate.
There's that side of it, but then literally the physicality of having to make sure that you have all of your identification, that you can get to the polling stations on time, that you know where it is. All of that requires a certain level of enfranchisement that, as we see socioeconomic conditions fall lower and lower, you don't have that same style of enfranchisement that others do. But I wanted to pick up on something that Heather said, because I think it was a really important concept that she brought up, which is this public square, right? Is this notion, Jürgen Habermas, a German political scientist, talks about the public sphere. And not to get too geeky on you, but in essence what the theory is that there is a discourse, a conversation that occurs around politics and about politics that needs to involve both the people who are the main actors within that sphere and those contributing to it. When you say that the square is empty or that sphere is empty, you're right. Because we have a political orthodoxy in Canada that suggests that nobody within these political parties can have a difference of opinion with one another. So unlike in, say, the United Kingdom, for instance, where we just saw Jeremy Corbyn elected Labour leader, he has, of course, some very right-wing members of his Social Democratic Party. Perhaps I'd be on that more right-wing side of his Social Democratic Party. Not a huge Jeremy Corbyn fan myself, but I can recognize and appreciate that that party has a leader that many people within it have a difference of opinion with. That can't happen in Canada. And I think young people see that. Young people recognize that what is created as the sphere in which you must operate is going to dictate the very outcome of what gets put into it. So for me, as a former political tactician, I'm the one responsible for all of this. I mean, mea culpa, I'm the one who, as a 23, 24-year-old, sat around boardroom tables saying, young people don't vote, stop putting money into campuses, this stuff isn't going to work. And it's that style of cynicism and talking point creation. And frankly, that's really what's hurting Canadian politics right now. So we need to step back from all of it and say, how do we have a better, more real conversation? And as Heather's talked about, fill that public square with better conversation.
Let me pick up on one word that you said there, though, and that word is responsibility. And Taylor, I want to get a better sense from you as to who is responsible for making sure that young people vote. If you're in university as a young person, you are already, to some extent, in a privileged position in our society. Do you feel it's incumbent upon people who are in post-secondary education spots in this country to say, you know what, I'll find the time to figure out how to vote, where to vote, what the issues are. I owe that to my country and myself as a citizen.
You mean young citizens?
Yeah.
Have taken on as their own responsibility to participate. I think that should be an underlying just a base of any of this. I think to ignore that treats people like sheep, as if they need to be taught or pushed into directions all the time. Now, that's kind of funny for me to say, because here we are working in elementary and high schools across the country, and we're doing exactly that. We're trying to ensure that working within the curriculum, not trying to change the curriculum that takes decades, where kids actually get a chance to experience the democratic process as a young person, as young as 10 years old. When you talk about this public square or circle, or just this idea that there's this hole of people missing from our citizenship, what we've taken on as our job, and it's a shared job with educators across Canada and school boards and teachers, is to build these skills and habits of citizenship, and ideally in a way where kids are experiencing their democracy, not just talking about it. What we're trying to do is bring people up to a place where they could watch this show and be interested enough to understand that there's different opinions, and to retreat those different opinions respectfully. I think that there's habits and skills of citizenship that can be created, and a commitment through the public education or private schools or Catholic schools, it doesn't matter. So, and then you see these kids on the show that you've been playing at 18, participating is normal for them. It's not something where they need a flashy candidate or a band to draw them in. They've already developed a sense of what we call civic duty. And I think that was the difference between two of the groups of kids there, students that you saw talking. The first ones, if you didn't notice, we're standing in front of the University of Toronto. So there's already a type of person that's going to that university that I expect have a sense more of civic duty. Then you had other kids, I didn't know where they were, and they seem to lack that. And that's one of the 4 indicators that Elections Canada has come up with in this kind of weird group of young people that actually vote. It's interest, knowledge, sense of civic duty, and a habit of speaking about the election or issues with their friends or their family.
Wouldn't read too much into those.
Sure,
the first group were from University of Toronto.
Sure.
You saw Robarts Library in the background. Second group is at Ryerson University. Okay. So, both downtown Toronto universities, you know?
You're going to get a letter.
There you go. You're going to get a letter. You know? But Sophia, I mean, tell me this, again, on this issue of responsibility. Is it incumbent upon the parties to speak to young people in a way that they appreciate, understand, value? Or is it more, look you're in university, you're in college, you're young, you've got your whole future ahead of you. You're smart. Take 20 minutes and get up on the issues and get out there and participate, for goodness sakes.
So there's also been studies that show that candidates are much less likely to contact young people, but when they do contact them, the young people are much more likely to go vote. And in fact, they're more proportionally likely to vote than an older cohort that's told to similarly vote. So a candidate reaching out to a young person makes a huge impact, and I think is something that is not happening at present. And they need to go to places where young people are, as Heather mentioned, and I think that it needs to go beyond just the formal academic and university spaces. We do see that students are much more likely to vote amongst young people than people outside of school. So they need to start going and diversifying kind of the spaces that are going to. And there's so many places that young people gather. And it just requires perhaps 2 young people on your campaign team to help inform where those young people are. And I think that's what a lot of political candidates aren't doing. And if they did outreach, we do see that makes a difference according to the studies that have been done.
I love how hopeful this is. But there's a reality at play here, which is that the young person has to want to vote, right? And if the very system in which they're operating in doesn't want them to vote, and I'll go one step further here. I actually
Is that right?
think
the system doesn't want them?
I think that there are certainly people within the system who absolutely do not want young people to vote.
Who are they?
Because they're unpredictable.
Correct, because they're incredibly unpredictable. Not because they vote a certain way, because actually that's not entirely true.
You don't know which way they'll
Exactly. They tend to trend. Most public opinion polling shows that the younger you are, the more left you tend to trend. But those numbers are not so far outside of the Canadian norm. It's that they are unpredictable. You can't figure out who and when and why they're going to vote. So it's not that they don't want them to vote. It's that they don't want to spend the resources, the time, the money, the effort, and the energy over many, many, many years to actually assure themselves that they're going to vote, as opposed to some of the outreach they do in some other very specific communities, where they know they can motivate those voters with a lot more predictability. And again, part of the problem here is that students are unpredictable. All of those students up there on the clips, I want to know how many of them actually go and vote. Because the other thing that I've done, and I've been a focus group moderator for years. I don't do the youth ones anymore. I'm looking a little too old these days. But I was told time and time and time again by those folks in that particular room, of course, that they were going to vote, that they were absolutely 100% engaged. And we did something called a double check mechanism, where we would chat with them on the way out the door, and we would ask a few other questions, so on and so forth. And one of the questions we were famous for asking is, what's your voting day plan? What riding are you in? Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm actually going to do that. Oh, but when you were in there with that large group of people, you said you were going to vote. Oh, well, that's what you're supposed to say, of course. And I'll give you one last anecdote. I'm on the board of directors of an incredible program, Forum for Young Canadians. We bring youth to Ottawa to experience Parliament Hill. I sit at these MPs' dinners with these 13, 14, and 15-year-olds, and they tell me the exact same thing that that gentleman in the clip at the beginning of the show said, which is, I know the system's important, I know how the system works, and I'm not touching it with a 10-foot pole. I dislike it that much that I refuse to vote. So I guess my other last element is that we should also recognize that a conscious objection to the system, whether it's through a spoiled ballot or whether it's through not showing up to the polls, is actually a legitimate political expression.
Yep.
If that's occurring, though.
If that's occurring. And I think there are. I think there are people who conscientiously say this system doesn't represent me. Take a look at Indigenous Canadians all across the country. I will not fault a single one of my friends who is on reserve or off reserve who doesn't vote, because this is not a system that for the past 200 years has supported them, has cared about them, not at all.
Let me bring age of the candidate into the mix and see if that matters at all. I think it's fair to say in this federal election we're currently engaged in, there's probably a larger number of young people who are going to either be with or vote for Justin Trudeau because he's the youngest of all of the leaders. Bridget is in Western Canada right now. When they had the mayor's race in Calgary several years ago, Naheed Nenshi got a lot of youth votes, and he's a very young guy himself. But we are seeing, and Bridget, let me go to you on this, we are seeing in the United States right now a lot of young people like Donald Trump, and he's in his 60s, and a lot of young people like Weekend at Bernie's. Yeah. Bernie Sanders is in his 70s, and he's just selling out university campuses all over the place. So I guess my question, Bridget, is does it matter how young or old the candidate is for young people to engage?
I think the most important thing is whether or not the candidate is speaking in a way that resonates with young people. And so it matters less about their age and more about sort of how they're engaging with young people. I think that a main reason why young people didn't vote in the last election, and studies have shown this, was because they were busy, they had other things, they had school, they had work, they were taking care of their families, for example. So I think it's really critical that we have places and candidates who are reaching out to young people, who are talking about youth issues, issues that young people care about, like the environment, healthcare, taxes, youth unemployment. And I think that that is one way that can engage more young people. And another really important thing is actually going to where young people are. So the current federal government in some ways has made it harder for young people to vote by taking away the voter ID cards with the Unfair Elections Act is what we call it. But it's also really important that we have ways that young people can vote on campuses. And actually there's a fantastic new initiative where there will be polling stations on 40 campuses across the country. And so today is actually our National Day of Action to get out the youth vote, where we will be storming the dorm on campus and promoting these polling stations on campus, which are from October 5th to October 9th. So I think it's really important that we are giving young people options in terms of when they can vote.
Let me follow up on that age business with you, Heather, because I assume at some point you've done some polling on whether young people like voting for young people. And yet here we see in the States, Bernie Sanders is just, bringing them in.
I asked, conducted 22 focus groups with low income and at-risk young people and asked them that question. And actually there was quite a bit of pushback against Trudeau, which was surprising. And they mentioned Rob Ford, Naheed Nenshi, Jack Layton came up. In a positive way. In a positive way, as ideal leaders. And I was thinking, and in Newfoundland, his name escapes me, but the issue is...
We're talking a premier or...
Premier. Danny Williams. Danny Williams.
Yeah.
And what the core, if they talked about, if they were seen to be fighting for them, age didn't really matter. It's how they felt. And one of the best expressions I ever heard was this person saying, politicians don't know what it's like to be hungry. And I thought, oh, hungry, they're ambitious, all right. And of course, in focus groups, your face is, but it wasn't hungry as an ambitious, it was hungry, actually hungry. And another young person said in Newfoundland, they don't know what it's like to stand and wait for a bus. I'd like politicians just to stand for a week to take a bus and know what it's like, what it feels like to be me.
Because if they had to, they wouldn't put up with whatever.
They'd be talking about something different. They would understand me. They would be able to represent me and fight for me. And if they can't do those things and they see them as disconnected, how can they? So it's not so much age, it's being like me.
You know, they don't even have to actually be like them. They just have to pretend, okay? So it's true. I'm ask Belinda Stronach, right? Here's a prime example of this.
What does that mean?
Belinda Stronach. So she, in 2 leadership races, captured the youth attention and the youth vote, first with the Conservatives and then with the Liberals. And she did this throughout her time with both of those parties. Young people flocked to her. You're absolutely right, not because she was young, but she knew how to speak to them. She knew which issues they truly cared about. So when she was back in that, you know, if we remember all the way back to that leadership race where she's talking about that big economic pie that she was always talking about.
Harper.
Exactly. Okay. She was talking about a piece of that pie for young people and for the youngest generation. Stephen Harper wasn't. You then saw her move into a variety of conservative conventions fighting for a youth wing for that party. Then when she flipped over to the Liberal Party, a lot of those young activists went with her. And moreover, more youth and young activists joined her in that side. And again, not because she's young, but because she knew exactly how to talk to them and was willing to do it. But guess what? She never stood in line for a bus. She never had to wait for a bus because she's still Belinda Stronach.
I hasten to point out, she didn't win either time.
No, she didn't.
And she, let's face it, she's a celebrity. Do young people care about celebrities running?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that helps explain the Trump phenomenon?
Yeah.
And Bernie Sanders has become a celebrity.
Ed Broadbent as well. When we take a look at the popularity of Ed Broadbent when he came back, it's kind of a bit of a redux sort of thing. Young people do, I mean, we see this in our work as an advertising agency all the time, have a nostalgia for things they never knew, right? So there is a throwback. There's a reason the record players are so popular, and it's not the hisses and the pops. It's the symbolism of having it, right? So, and again, we see this a lot within sort of obsession over Polaroids and a variety of other different things. You know, we take a look at Instagram as a really good example of sort of this crossover between the two, and that is, I think, the exact moment that politicians can engage, is when they have a familiarity with the technology, and maybe they were really good at it in the 60s or 70s, and now they start to do it again. And here's where we see a guy like Norm, for instance, the famous city councillor in Toronto, doing so well online with young people. Not his politics.
Norm Kelly is a 74-year-old guy from Scarborough.
Oh, he's a right-winger. He's like, I mean, he's part of, he's a charter member of the Ford team here. So and that doesn't matter, but he's very popular because he knows who Meek Mills is, you know, and he knows what a meme is, and he has people on his team who can make memes, because he's not making memes himself, let's face it, and who's getting them out there, right? So he's got great advisors as well. He's got some of the best young people in Toronto politics around him who happen to be conservatives, who are telling him, hey, this would be funny, and
I
this
should
would be
say
great.
for the record, he used to be a Liberal MP, but he's on maybe the small C part of the Liberal Party.
I think he's gone a little,
This is kind of the point that was mentioned as being hopeful before, that these are candidates who have, or politicians who have a young person on their team. Norm Kelly has admitted that he doesn't listen to rap music. So there's obviously some young person, he claims it's his stepson, who's helping him with his tweets. And using social media, all you need really is 1 or 2 young people on your side telling you how to maneuver, where young people are, how to outreach to them. And we see that translates into a huge interest in political issues. Perhaps it doesn't necessarily translate into the ballot box, but it nonetheless turns a lot of general cynicism or general sense that this is not actually including me into a process that now does include them.
I'm actually looking this up right now. I want to find out. Matt, you've got me so curious right now, because I'm going on Twitter as we speak here, and I want to find out how many Twitter followers Norm Kelly has, and I think it's about
like 100,000.
I think it's more than 150,000 actually. I'm just going to I'm going to look right now.
A couple weeks ago, and it had a lot. I think to some of this stuff though, when you talk about some of those bigger names, even like Ford, there's a for these successful people that have engaged any core audience, I think they're also authentic. Yes. They don't just have a couple young people making snappy tweets. I think anyone can see through that, young or old.
Taylor?
So there is
175,000.
175,000.
For a Toronto City Councillor from Scarborough.
Yeah, that's like 100,000 more than me.
Yeah. Not bad, not bad.
But that changes his politics too. So when we engage this way, and when he's decided to engage so many young people writ large, he has to recognize that that's not all the young people just within his ward. And moreover now, who's he playing to? Right? Is he now playing to a whole audience of young people across North America, or is he doing his job as a city councillor? So you can take this too far as well.
Okay, let me, sorry, Heather, you want to say one thing before we go on?
What this underlines is how if you actually just signal that we care what you think, if you signal that I get Drake, then you're going to have a response. They're not completely tuned out, and they want to engage. Just give me something to work with, and that's where the hope comes in.
Apropos of that, we went back to the streets. I don't know if this is U of T or Ryerson. We'll see from the background. What issues do young people care about? Okay, let's find out what they had to say. Roll the clip, please.
I really want to think about the future in Canada, and I don't think that Harper is really thinking about the future. He's more thinking about the now.
I'll be voting for the Conservatives. I think they frankly have the strongest position on national defence and Canadian security, and especially that they are the party I trust the most to be sticking up for justice against the so-called Islamic State and in the ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
Certain human rights issues, such as like the Aboriginals issues that have been coming around, environmental issues, and the economy probably. Those are like the three biggest things.
I'm a really big supporter of the NDP's policies. Affordable housing is a really big issue, especially in downtown Toronto. The price of housing is skyrocketing. We believe that cost should never be a barrier to a smart mind having a good education.
Okay, let's get into this. Brigitte, to you first. What issues do you think really turn young people's cranks, if I can put it that way? It's an English expression. Go ahead.
Yes. One of the recent studies showed that young people care most about healthcare, the environment, youth jobs, taxes, and education. And so on all of these issues, though, we see that the current federal government is failing us. So for example, on the environment, we see they rejected Kyoto, and they're promoting so many pipelines. But we see progressive parties that are taking leadership on this and are proposing some real changes. We see on youth unemployment as well, the Conservatives have cut youth unemployment programs, and yet we see other parties that are showing leadership on this. Healthcare, the Conservatives are also promising cuts to this, and we see that progressive parties are about protecting a good healthcare system. Another issue that was brought up in the film, which I think is really important, is around Indigenous issues. So the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Conservatives are refusing an inquiry, and yet every other party is committed to an inquiry for these women. So I think it's clear that on youth issues, the current government is going in the wrong direction, but that we can see change through these other progressive parties.
I feel somewhat obliged to say, just in the interest of keeping the record straight here, that you say the Conservatives are promising cuts on health care. And the Conservatives would say, I presume, we've increased healthcare spending to the provinces by 6% at a time when inflation was running at 2%. And even when inflation is running at 2%, we're still going to run our transfers at 3%, which is beyond inflation. It's not 6, but it's still well ahead of inflation. So where's the cut?
The cut, I believe it's upwards of $50 million cuts. If you go to Canadians.org/IWillVote, we have the exact numbers in terms of the cuts that the Conservatives are proposing.
Go ahead, Ian.
Well, the Conservatives aren't actually proposing a cut. They're proposing not to fulfill it to the exact same levels that it's being fulfilled now.
A reduction of the rate of increase.
Correct. Yeah. And I think these words are important because I think that what Brigitte did, unfortunately, was sort of also attempt to suggest that all young voters have a problem with this current government, and I don't think they do. But moreover, what's missing is about $43.5 billion in the 8 years that follows 2017. So that money does, I think, need to be there. Otherwise, things that are being funded now won't be able to be funded in the future. So thus, we're picking a bit of fly poop out of pepper, as my father would say here, trying to decide whether it's a cut or money that isn't there. But I think Brigitte is absolutely right when she says something which was very interesting, which is, young people care about the exact same topics that old people care about. You see that healthcare, jobs, taxes,
but this confuses me because I know older people care about healthcare because they get sick and they need to know the hospital, the doctor, the nurse, the whatever is there for them. Young people don't get sick very often.
That's not true, though. So we've done this, you won't believe this, or maybe you will, actually. You will, Ian. We've done this project over the last 3 years where we get kids to give in their opinions to the Minister of Finance on the federal budget. And if you can believe it, for 3 years in a row, their ultimate priority compared to anything else was paying down the debt before an investment in healthcare, education, the environment. So what I've always been, I guess, maybe just just found a bit annoying is that this idea that there was these separate or distinct youth issues, and I mean this respectfully, Brigitte, I don't wholeheartedly disagree with you. I just think that once people know enough, any issue is palatable, especially to a young person. I mean, comically, yes, we have heard from teachers that sometimes the kids do want to explore the marijuana issue, but there is 3 distinct, or at least pretty much different options right now for any young people if that was like their pull issue to the polls. But almost always we found that kids have the capacity, once they know enough, to deal with any adult issue.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. Pot's the one. If you want a young youth issue that literally eclipses everything else, it's pot. It is. It's
but it is as a starter. It's not as a. It's not the. That's like the comical beginning, and that's great. That's an entryway for a young person to participate if that's what it is. And I would not say that that's like so wide.
It's a gateway drug to democracy.
Apparently, it's a gateway drug. That's
well, I wonder. Let's put some. If we can, Heather. Let's do language here. Are some people intimidated by the language? For example, what does liberalism mean? What does socialism mean? What does conservatism mean? Are they confused by these terms?
What level of government is responsible for what? All kinds of things about the government structure are confusing. And I do want to go. One of the things that they also, what I found with young people is there was an intensity on things that affected them personally. And so things like pensions and healthcare they care about, and they can talk relatively speaking about it. But when it comes to stop online piracy, when it talks marijuana, things that are directly police intimidation, if you're in Scarborough, those are the issues that came up more often. And they talk to them. They talk to me about those issues, very sophisticated in their language. But back to your original question, are they intimidated by the political structures? Absolutely. They don't know who to call, how to get help. They don't know anything about it, and that's why this gentleman does amazing stuff.
I don't even mean the structures. I mean, Safia, if you're a young person, let's say you're 18, you're following a campaign for the first time in your life, you're going to get to vote for the first time. You see that the Social Democratic Party is the one that is pledging come hell or high water to balance the budget. You see the Liberal Party, which you hear about from your parents' time, was the one that actually, come hell or high water, did balance the budget, is now pledging to run deficits. You see that the NDP leader and the Conservative leader are saying the same thing on balanced budgets versus deficits, but the Liberals, who actually did balance the books 20 years ago, are the ones who are now saying we're going to run some deficits. Is all this too confusing for everybody?
I consider myself highly engaged, and I find voting so complex and confusing. When I go to the ballot box, I don't actually know what I'm voting for. Am I voting for my local candidate? Am I voting for my party? Am I voting for the party leader? Am I voting for an issue? And of those multiple choices, which one do I like best? And so it's really, really confusing, and I think that the confusion personally increases as I find myself getting more engaged. And so I think that oftentimes the problem is the system overall, and I don't think that there's necessarily clarity on the system. And going back to Ian's point about young people actively being left out in terms of political strategizing, sometimes I think young people or people who can't spend their entire days following the elections or following politics, I think in many ways we're actively left out of the overall political system. Never mind the strategists, the system itself was built in many ways that excludes so many, and which is why we see low voter turnout, not only amongst young people, but amongst immigrants, amongst low income, amongst Muslims, amongst racialized people. So it's
the only constitutionally allowable form of discrimination that remains.
Say again?
The only allowable constitutional form of discrimination that remains is on age, and it's your allowability and your eligibility to sit in the Senate. And that should be immediately removed right away. So any form of voting reform needs to be predicated on the fact that all young people should be enfranchised to the exact same level that everybody else is. To be able to sit in the Senate, you don't need to, I don't think, have to own property or be a certain age. But moreover, this goes to an actual solution to the problem. And I think Taylor's organization has been doing this so well for so long. We just need to legislate it. And that means real active youth enfranchisement. I'm talking letting 16-year-olds vote. We need to get young people voting sooner. When we decided the age of majority, we decided it way back when people died a lot earlier, and the education system was nowhere near where it is now.
What number do you like? 16.
I think municipal elections, to start off in Ontario, we should be voting at 16 in the next couple of them. At provincial elections, you should start voting at the age of 17, and then in federal elections at the age of 18, and we should amalgamate all of those ages over a phase-in period of a little bit of time, a couple of years to just under a decade or so, to get everybody used to when you'll be voting. And then in essence, what we'll be able to do is catch the vast majority of young people in one of their years of high school and bring them to a proper polling station, put them through classes and education like the ones that Civics is doing with Student Vote right now, and really have them invested in learning that habitual active voting. So I think it's really important. I think that there have been some incredibly articulate young voices on this issue, but the problem with young voices, as we know, is they get old. They stop caring about enfranchisement, and they get ignored.
All right,
so I'm really looking forward to some real fundamental changes in the way we vote after the next election, because I think there's some opportunities at play.
Speaking of change, we know the NDP are running on change that has experience. We know the Liberals are running on real change. But one of the things, again, as we took our cameras to the streets, where young people said to us, they're all kind of the same, and it doesn't matter who I vote for, it's not going to be, despite what the Liberals say, real change. Let's hear some of those voices. Roll the clip, please.
I'm not voting because none of the parties represent the people. They're all the same representatives of the ruling capitalist class, and none of them represent the vast majority of people who work for a living and who have nothing to gain from this system. Historically, all the changes that have been made to actually fundamentally alter society have not been through elections, but have been made through revolution. So for instance, the Great October Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. And so elections will never actually change anything.
Let the anchor of the program confirm and clarify something his producers apparently don't understand. We're not advocating violent revolutionary overthrow of the government in this country. Producers, thanks. Okay, Brigitte, how much of this is out there, namely that they're all the same, they're not really going to be any, it doesn't matter who comes in, it's not really going to be any different from the last guy?
I think it's a really critical point, and to be honest, I almost didn't vote in the last election for that reason, feeling like, you know, the only way that we're going to make change is through nonviolent direct action. It's how we've seen major changes, like through the civil rights movement, etc. At the same time, now I have a change of opinion, and I think that it's not one or the other, but we actually need to do both. And it's sort of like, you know, voting is kind of the least that you can do. After seeing what the Conservative government has done in terms of undermining Indigenous rights, the destruction of the environment, not taking the view of the majority of people, I think that it's really critical that we vote, and it's just one step towards seeing the change that we want. But it's also really critical that we get involved in social movements. It's been absolutely incredible to see the times that we're in. We are in revolutionary times, from Occupy to I Don't Know More to Black Lives Matter. There are some real system critiques that are being voiced by young people, and we're starting to see change on some of those issues.
Absolutely fair points, but Heather, let me follow up with this. Yes, there are some significant differences among all of the major parties. There are. Having said that, they're all pretty much basically in favor of lowering small business tax. The big difference between the NDP and the Conservatives on corporate income taxes is 2 points. Between the Liberals and everybody else on income taxes is 2 points on the upper end. There are lots of areas where they're all sort of swimming around in the mushy middle. So if you're a young person and you say, I don't really need to vote, they're all kind of pretty much the same, is that a completely illogical conclusion for them to come to?
I don't know whether it's a completely illogical conclusion to come to, but there is, I mean, I read this morning in the newspaper that there's consensus on most of the major issues. Yeah. So, and I would say as a political scientist, there is consensus on most of the major issues. There are personality differences and leadership differences, but really digging back into young people is, what kind of revolution, and it is, what kind of revolution would young people have? And it wouldn't be in the form of probably the three major leaders that we're seeing. So,
Ian, do young voters have an unrealistic expectation of what a parliamentary democracy is able to change?
No.
They don't?
No. We've had a parliamentary democracy that's created the best medical system in the entire world. It's created assurances that when you don't have a job, that this state is going to take care of you. We have a parliament, though I agree with you, that on the vast majority of things passes things on division. We don't even need to vote on them. Yeah. And I think that that is the success of Canada, not the failure of Canada. I think that it's absolutely incredible that we agree on, I say oftentimes in speeches that I give to young people, over 80% of everything we do in Canada we agree on. We fight over so absolutely little that it's incredible when you compare us to even other G7 nations and the divisions within their politics. That said, it makes it really tough for everyday youth to decide which one of these political parties makes the most sense for them. So I mean, I have a great hope, a massive hope that after the next election we have, for the first time ever, every single one of our political parties says the Senate needs to be reformed. That's a first in Canadian history. 2 of our political parties say we need fundamental voting reform on how and needing to change the first past the post system. What that is going to do, and forgive my NDP friends for saying this, it's going to kick open the door to a lot more political parties. So if you take a look at the New Democrats, the Conservatives, and the Liberals, they won't exist in this format anymore. After a proportional representation style system, there will be many other choices.
And young people will prefer that?
I think that what you may in fact have is parties that spring up that serve young people very specifically. You may have other political parties that pop up that have a very specific niche direction. You may see, for instance, the resurgence and the strength of the marijuana party, for instance, in a proportional representation system, taking a lot of young people if Mr. Trudeau doesn't get his way and legalizes it before then, but they'll find another issue on which they can then really focus. And I think that that's the beauty of some form of voting reform, whether it's proportional representation or not, is that it allow more of a diversity of voices within that small wedge of things that we actually do disagree on.
Apropos of the discussion we had earlier about young people actually feeling a lot of the same way as older people do on various issues, we've got a graphic that suggests that. Sheldon, can we bring this up here? This is from Samara. This is the advocacy group that encourages political engagement. They found what those under 30 are less likely to vote. We already showed you numbers on that. They match or surpass other age groups when it comes to other forms of political engagement. For example, they are as likely to be a party member as someone who's over the age of 55. They are actually more likely to attend a political meeting than older Canadians are. They have donated to campaigns on par with Canadians who are over the age of 55. They are more likely to volunteer, more likely to give a political speech in public, or more likely to organize a political event than those of their seniors. So, I can see you're champing at the bit to get in on this. What do you say?
I've been chomping at the bit for the last 15 minutes.
Champing,
no,
not chomping.
I guess what I wonder is it's the same thing when you ask a young person, did they vote? And 75% of them say they did. And really 38 did.
So the numbers lie?
Well, no, I don't know. I think everyone, actually, we've done enough surveys now that I'm not sure I trust any one of them. But I think what you're really getting at here is there's a difference between, some people don't think that political participation is effective. I think where I come from, this is personally not necessarily from my organization, is that it's the irreplaceable act of participation. A lot of the issue-driven campaigns only go so far where they're trying to have politics respond or have a bill or law changed. So I think that it's everyone should volunteer. Everyone should contribute to a campaign, whether it's a political campaign or an issue campaign. But in the end, if you're not actually casting a ballot at the ballot box, you're not getting the change that I think you want. It's still something that's like against the system. I think also too, going back to Safia's point, where you spoke about the complexity of our politics, I would hope that it is. I would hope that it is, and this is just, I'm in agreement with you, that I agree too. Oh, there's all this stuff to sift through. Who do you believe? How much can any one of these parties actually change our economy when maybe it's not even in our hands?
Well, let me go to, okay, Safia, again, on these numbers that we just saw here, does this jibe with your understanding of things, that young people are just as actively involved in volunteering, donating, giving speeches, et cetera, et cetera?
Definitely. I think that this notion that young people are apathetic or disengaged simply because they don't vote is misled and oftentimes very patronizing. And I do trust those numbers based on kind of the work that we've been doing at Can You Engage and the work that I just generally have been doing in a lot of communities that I work in have low voter turnouts, but there's a really high level of political engagement. And I think that the reason why older generations are voting is due to this sense of civic duty, that voting is fundamental to what it means to be a citizen, and that doesn't necessarily play with a lot of young people. And I think perhaps that's simply because the system is seen to be so exclusive or not work. And I mean, there's this quotation that I've heard actually quite a number of my friends and contemporaries say recently, and it comes from Lauryn Hill, and it's, we seem to lose the game before we even start to play. So, I'm going to vote, yeah, I'm going to politically engage, but at the end of the day, is that really making a difference? And I think it comes to this sense that we need immediate change. And so what I think that one of the important roles of a lot of the Get Out the Vote campaigns or a lot of the Get Out the Vote organizations is to show that immediate change perhaps maybe not possible, but that political engagement, formal political engagement and participation through voting can make a slow, sustained difference over time, and I think it needs to be followed. We're telling young people, you need to vote, but we do no work after that. We make zero work, and so oftentimes when I've done that, when I've done get out the vote stuff, I oftentimes worry that people will go out to the polls and they vote, perhaps the incumbent gets reelected, nothing necessarily changed. Will they vote again? Probably not. We expended so much energy in that one time that they did vote and they did take our word for it, it didn't result in any change. So I'm actually interested to see what happens in the United States following that big surge of young people voting for Obama and that not resulting in the kind of change that they wanted.
Just a quick follow-up on your sourcing here on behalf of the 55 pluses. Lauryn Hill's a singer, right? Yeah. She's a singer?
She's from the 90s.
She's from the okay. Sophia? I'm not, though. Okay, so we're just checking here. Heather, online voting.
Yes.
Yes, no? Would it make a difference?
Online voting, actually, the early data that's in at the municipal level is it matters to those over 65. And not under 30, is that online voting doesn't promise a reason to get out to vote and doesn't engage young people anymore. It doesn't address some of the problems that we've already discussed. That said, 65-year-olds, it's more convenient for them.
It's a horrific idea, though. We shouldn't do it. I mean, just straight out of the gate, there is not a former Chief Electoral Officer of Canada anywhere that will tell you that it's a good idea. I mean, our banking system is what oftentimes people compare this to. Oh, well, if you can bank online. But what a lot of people don't realize or know is that that system's hacked on a regular basis and the money goes right back into your account with you ever not even noticing that it perhaps wasn't there. It's violated on a regular occurrence.
Old-fashioned X marks the spot.
That is the only way we can vote. I mean, straight up, I mean, I think study after study, both in the scientific realm and in the practical realm, suggests that online voting is an impossibility. But you know what it's trying to do? It's trying to address the elephant in this room, which is laziness. We haven't talked about it, and I'm just going to say it. A lot of young people don't vote because they are actually lazy.
Let me follow up. Let me follow up with
prioritizing.
It's for sure priorities, whatever you want to call it. But straight out, what parents call it is laziness.
Ian, I'm not going to call it that. But Brigitte, let me get you to comment on this. Maybe it's not laziness. Maybe it's contentment. Is it possible that young people are just content regardless of who wins, and therefore they don't vote? Brigitte, what do you say?
I don't think so. I mean, we have a study that shows that 80% of young people want to see a change in government. So I do think that there's definitely that hunger there for a change. I think, and based on studies, it shows that more so the #1 reason why young people didn't vote was because they were swamped. Like, young people are busy. They're working like 2 jobs to pay the rent. You know, they're taking care of their family. They're going to school. Like, it's not easy. And so I think it's really trying to focus on making it easy for young people to be able to vote, and that's a really key priority.
Taylor.
I think it's about prioritizing. If it's my friend's birthday and they live 2 hours away and it's this weekend, I'm going to make it a priority to go, and nothing's going to get in the way. What you need to do, and what I think our education system is trying to do, and what we've been trying to do at Civics and through Student Vote, and we're in half of all schools in Canada in this election, is build that appetite, that interest, so there is no excuse left other than choosing with that capacity to not go to the polls. And that's a different conversation.
But fundamentally, I stand by my point that not just young people, Canadians, people are lazy. The reason that they don't vote as high in municipal elections is because they don't want to.
You are obviously never running for anything ever.
No, ever. No, I mean, believe me, the number of times I've said stuff like this on television. But the frustrating part that I have is that we don't sometimes recognize humanity as well. So we have all these other great ideas and reasons why people don't vote, and all of them are legitimate and accurate and real, but we have to admit that there is just a subsection
of that.
They're not going to be moved to the polls, and we've got to admit that, figure out who they are.
Take the last minute. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think that, this notion that, it's good to vote and it's good to be engaged, and that's what a good citizen does, but it's hard to be a good citizen. It's hard to be a good voter, to civically engage when you're poor, when you're vilified, when you're working a few jobs, when no one's speaking about your issues, when no one's coming to your communities, when you see yourself not represented whatsoever in the political systems and no kind of appetite to even change that representation in any meaningful way. So to say it's laziness, sure, I think that's a cohort. And in the documentary, in the drop, I think certainly there were some elements of that present. But I noticed, watching the drop, that the only Canadian of color interviewed was Olivia Chow. and perhaps the supporter of Ford. And so I wonder, if we actually diversified the kind of voices, the young voices present in this discussion, why don't young people engage, why aren't they voting, what's happening in our political system, what we'll find is actually a more comprehensive and diverse and more representative, a wholesome picture of exactly why people are disengaging.
That's a wonderful, hopeful note to leave this on. You're all voting, I assume, yes? Yes, the people at this table and in Vancouver are voting. Good to hear. Brigitte de Pape, it's so good of you to join us on the line from Vancouver. Thanks so much. Merci beaucoup, madame. À la prochaine fois.
Thank you, merci.
And here at our table in Toronto, Ian Capstick from Media Style, Heather Bastido, formerly of Queen's University, Taylor Gunn, the founding president of Civics, and Safia Chaudhry, co-founder of, the short form is Can You Engage? Thecandidate.com, the Candidate Youth Engagement Workshop. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.